Somewhere between Malaysia and Indonesia, there is a strip of water 2.8 kilometers wide at its narrowest point that is approximately the length of 28 football fields. Right now, as you watch this, there are ships moving through it. There are always ships moving through it. And what happens in that strip of water determines whether the store near you has anything on its shelves. The phone in your pocket, the ibuprofen in your medicine cabinet, the running shoes by your door, the fuel in your car, the laptop on your desk, the shirt you're wearing right now. All of it, with very few exceptions, pass through the same 2.8 kilometers of water. The Strait of Malacca. It connects the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. It is the primary maritime route between Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. And 40% of all global trade moves through it every year. Every single day, approximately 94,000 ships move through the Strait of Malacca. That is more than one ship every single second. It carries more than $5 trillion in trade value every year. To put that in perspective, the entire GDP of Japan passes through this strait every 12 months. This is not a distant problem. This is not an abstract geopolitical concern. This is the infrastructure your economy runs on. So let's go inside it. The geography here is simple. To the north, the South China Sea. To the south, the Indian Ocean. In between, a strip of water flanked by Malaysia on one side and the Indonesian island of Sumatra on the other. There are theoretically alternative routes. The Lombok Strait, the Sunda Strait, the Makassar Strait, but none of them are equivalent. They are deeper, longer, more expensive, and lack the port infrastructure that 150 years of maritime trade built around Malacca. Rerouting global shipping away from Malacca would add, on average, between 2 and 5 days to transit time. In global supply chain terms, that is not a detour. That is a crisis. The world built its supply chains around this one passage, and the world has not built a credible alternative. In 2004, piracy in the Strait of Malacca reached what the International Maritime Bureau classified as crisis levels. Attacks on vessels, armed boardings, crew members held at gunpoint, ships seized and their cargo sold. Lloyd's of London, the world's leading maritime insurer, added the Strait of Malacca to its list of war risk zones. That designation has a cost. Every ship that transits the strait pays a war risk premium. That premium is passed on to the manufacturer, to the retailer, to you. The piracy decreased after a joint patrol initiative between Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore was established in 2004. It did not disappear. Now here is the part that makes this genuinely complicated. The country that controls the most critical point in the strait is Singapore. Singapore is an American ally. It hosts American naval facilities. It cooperates on intelligence. But Singapore is also economically dependent on China to a degree that creates what analysts call the Singaporean dilemma. If China applied sufficient economic pressure, Singapore's ability to keep the strait open to American interests becomes a political question, not just a military one. And then there is China itself. China moves roughly 80% of its energy imports through Malacca. China calls this the Malacca dilemma, its own vulnerability, which means China has spent the last 15 years building alternatives. pipelines through Myanmar, ports in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka. The Belt and Road Initiative is, in part, a strategy to stop depending on Malacca. The United States has no equivalent strategy. China is solving its Malacca problem. The United States is still using Malacca as if it will always be open. In 2004, the United States Department of Defense published the National Strategy for Maritime Security. The document identified the Strait of Malacca explicitly as one of the world's most critical strategic choke points. It warned that a disruption, whether from conflict, terrorism, or accident, would have, and I'm quoting directly, cascading effects on the global economy. That document was published in 2004. It is now 20 years later. The United States has not developed a credible alternative supply chain route that bypasses Malacca. It has not built the port infrastructure that would make alternatives viable. It has not concluded the trade agreements that would make rerouting economically feasible. The warning existed. The response did not. The document existed. The warning was explicit. Nothing changed. While the United States published warnings and held congressional hearings and updated strategy documents, China built the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the port in Hambantota, Sri Lanka, the Kyaukphyu pipeline through Myanmar, the port in Gwadar. These are not just trade investments, they are alternative routes. China has spent the last 15 years solving its own Malacca vulnerability. The American equivalent is a 2004 document that most people in Washington have never read. I want to be precise about what the threat here actually is. It is not that China will close the Strait of Malacca. China is as dependent on it as anyone. Closing it would damage China as much as the United States. The threat is different. The threat is that China has built alternatives, and the United States has not, which means that in a conflict scenario, we say over Taiwan, China has options. It can reroute through its own infrastructure. It can apply pressure on Malacca through Singapore. It can threaten disruption without actually disrupting. The threat alone would be enough to move markets, to spike fuel prices, to create the kind of economic pressure that shapes political decisions. You don't close the strait, you just make everyone believe you could. Last episode, we followed cobalt from a mine in Congo to an EV battery in Ohio. This episode, we followed everything else through 2.8 kilometers of water that most Americans have never heard of. The supply chains that run your life pass through places your government has documented, warned about, and not fixed. And the question no one is answering is what happens the day China doesn't need to close it, because it already has somewhere else to go.